My name is Jannie Lilja, and I'm the Director of Studies for Peace and Development Research with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. And I'm thrilled to be moderating this panel with and about the World Food Programme. The WFP is not only the world's largest humanitarian agency, it is also the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And today we will be digging deeper into how the WFP is reconciling its mission to end global hunger with a principled approach to peace. I think that this discussion is particularly timely and pertinent in light of the fact that humanitarian needs are increasing while resources to address them are not. And today we'll be zooming in on how the WFP constructively tackles trade-offs and challenges in being a humanitarian organization with its ambition to also contribute to the prospects of peace. The WFP is often the organization that comes in when other organizations are leaving, and it often finds itself in settings where it has to share the operational space with actors pursuing military objectives. Our panel today will try to identify best practices and lessons learned from within the WFP when it comes to contributing to peace in a variety of ways. And we will also try to situate the WFP's role as a partner and member of the international community by discussing comparative strengths and complementarities with other actors. But let me first introduce our stellar lineup of speakers. We have 4 distinguished panelists from the WFP and 1 external speaker. So let me first introduce you to Dr. Carlos Caramella. He is currently the WFP's representative and country director in Colombia. Carlo has over 25 years of experience of working in development and humanitarian settings at a global level, as well as in Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Latin America. Secondly, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Paul Howe, who is WFP Country Director for Nigeria since 2019. And Paul has over 15 years of experience in the WFP, including from Afghanistan, Laos, Uganda, and headquarters, where he has held different types of senior positions in the past years. Our third speaker also has an impressive background from several hot crises. Matthew Hollingworth, who is currently WFP Country Director for South Sudan. Matthew has been with the WFP for 19 years and has served also in Sudan, in the MENA region, in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. And he used to be the WFP Country Director and representative in war-torn Syria from 2013 to 2015. I'm also delighted to welcome our 4th WFP panelist, Maria Vitoria Montalvo Siles, who is the director of the WFP Security Division. Maria Victoria, she joined the WFP in 2017 and took up her duties as Director of Security in 2019. And prior to joining the WFP, she served at the UN Department of Safety and Security in New York, Colombia, and Senegal. And she has extensive security experience from various UN agencies and from the private sector as well. And finally, I'm very happy to introduce our 5th panelist, the only non-WFP speaker, Aissatou Kaspar, who is currently the Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration, IOM, in Burkina Faso. And Aissatou is also the former head of the UN Peacebuilding Fund, the Secretary General's own fund, Secretariat in Mali, and she will be offering valuable reflections from a WFP partner perspective. This session will be divided into 3 segments. So the first segment will be the speakers answering 2 questions each. And the second block will consist of a Q&A session. So I'll open up the floor. And I think that we received a note from our technical moderator. Our panelists would really love for you, our online audience, to pose questions. And so please feel free to type away your question in the chat function, and we will try to answer as many as possible in this second block. And finally, we'll be closing by letting our panelists offer their main takeaways. But let's now turn to the WFP country directors. And I'm now addressing you, Carlo, Paul, and Matthew. You all have significant experience of work with the WFP, and you head up WFP operations in some of the most complex and protracted humanitarian crises. These are truly situations where conflict continues to drive food insecurity and humanitarian needs with really no clear end in sight. So in these contexts, my question to you is, how are your programs contributing to peace and stability? Let me first give the floor to you, Carlos Carmela.
Thanks a lot, Jannie, for the introduction, and thanks for having us here as part of this panel. Super interesting and very welcome, very timely, I think. Colombia is a country that is going through a formal peace process. So WFP is engaged in this process, which basically is based on a peace accord that was signed in 2016 after a long negotiation, and it's basically led to the demobilization of large part of the so-called FARC, the Armed Forces of Colombia, Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. WFP is the force supporting the process of demobilization and reintegration, socioeconomic reintegration of former combatants and their families. And in that context, also assisting the communities that are somehow in the same areas where this process is taking place. And so we are having a stabilization intervention in support of the formal peace process. But the real challenge in Colombia is not just ensuring the peace accord, it's also tackling two additional dimensions of conflict, violence, and potentially displacement. One is related to ongoing dynamics within the country that in fact are connected to the expansion of illegal economies, mainly linked to the coca production, that are, let's say, the key factor and the key reason for an ongoing displacement. Colombia last year has produced over 100,000 people newly displaced or confined in their locations. So WFP is also, as a second pillar of its intervention in Colombia, addressing these needs and these requirements of people who have been uprooted from their lands and have seen their basically lifelines and livelihoods destroyed. Thirdly, WFP in Colombia is also supporting the response to a mass migration crisis, which is originating from bordering country Venezuela, and has seen up to 1.8 million migrants in country in Colombia with the intention of residing in Colombia, plus another 2 million people, let's say, passing through towards the south of the continent. And this constitutes a third pillar of intervention, of course, meaning that we are intervening in a manner that is, on one hand, supporting a national institution, stabilize the context, while at the same time providing opportunities for many migrants to reinsert themselves into national economies. So we have three pillars of interventions, each of them with very specific characteristics. And for each of these pillars, I think we are trying to leverage opportunities with a, let's say, a Nexus approach lens. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlo, for providing these valuable insights from this post-peace accord circumstances. Paul, you're currently heading WFP interventions in Nigeria. Would you say that your operations are or have been contributing to peace and stability in the same way as Carlos has described it?
Oh, thank you very much, Jannie, and it's a pleasure to be here. And I'd say that WFP in Nigeria is working on peace in a slightly different way than in Colombia, because we're in a slightly different context. And there's kind of two principal ways that I would identify. One is that the level of our activities, and the other is at a more strategic level. But as I said, the context is different. There's a conflict ongoing in the Northeast, and that's where we have a lot of our operations. And let me give you a couple of examples of how our activities are engaging with peace. So in certain locations in the Northeast, internally displaced people from the rural areas have joined what we could call host communities in garrison towns. So communities that are actually sealed off by a trench for the safety and protection of the population. And it works really well in that sense. But as a result, of course, there's not the same level of services or livelihood opportunities that they might hope for. And the danger and the risk is that those two communities being put together in a small space without a lot of support could lead to tensions, conflict, despair, and hopelessness. And what we've tried to do is intervene with our partners, with the government in a smart way that changes that potentially negative dynamic into a positive one. So we have something called, in a place called Woza, which is near the Cameroonian border, a program called the Fresh Food Vouchers. And what happens is that the local host community, the ones who are farmers, go to their lands, which are still within the trench, so still within the protected area, and are able to grow fruits, vegetables, other types of food that are healthy and nutritious. And then the internally displaced populations are given a voucher so that they can actually buy it from those local producers. And that interaction becomes a real win-win, because the smallholder producers, local producers, are able to provide food, gain a livelihood by doing that. And the IDPs are able to have some choice in what they're able to buy, and they're benefiting from having that produce fresh and local available to them. So instead of dividing the community, what that does is it brings them together and fosters a sense of social cohesion. And also, when the economy starts going and there's a little bit of market, then suddenly other livelihood activities and opportunities start to pop up. And you have a positive dynamic that's leading to greater optimism and hope in a very challenging environment. So that's at the activity level. But if we zoom out and look across, the northeastern states, especially of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe, where there's this conflict ongoing, it's important to think about how these humanitarian and development type of activities can link to stabilization efforts. And so stabilization efforts in this context may take the form of helping dig those trenches, or putting in lights or perimeter fences or office buildings for government staff. But if we can develop work in those same locations, then suddenly the impacts of each of these efforts is magnified and amplified, and there's real positive possibilities. And if we do that not in one location, but across different locations, then the possibilities are even increased further. And so it's both at the activity level and the strategic level, but in a context of an ongoing conflict, that we're trying to contribute to peace in Northeast Nigeria. Thanks, Jannie.
Thanks a lot, Paul. Truly fascinating how you, through rigging livelihoods approaches in a deliberate way, actually can create this win-win type of situations between the displaced populations and the host communities. And thanks also for bringing up that point of sort of where you are along the conflict cycle really matters. On that note, I would like to turn to our third country director, Matthew. You are currently in South Sudan, and you're leading one of the WFP's largest operations in the world. And you have this experience of having served in Syria. Do you recognize the sort of ways of going about and the different approaches needed to promote peace and stabilization in the context of a hot crisis?
Hi, Jannie, and hello to everybody who's joined us. Yes, I recognize a lot of similarity, but of course, context is everything, and context gives us the basis of defining how we use, in some cases, similar tools in different ways. But I mean, if I were to try and answer your question with one word, your first question, how do we actually contribute to peace and stability in South Sudan? And the one word I would use is deliberately. We actually ensure that in South Sudan, we have created a contributing to peace strategy for our operations. In order to do that, a vast amount of work was put in place to really understand at a granular level across a country where there are very different communities, very different regions with different problems, to define, based on that sort of context, what we should be doing moving forward to have some kind of impact on peace and stability. I mean, clearly for us in South Sudan, South Sudan's a country, when it was Southern Sudan, it's been at war in one way or another for decades. And there's some commonalities over those decades that haven't changed. Communities that are isolated, communities that are marginalized, communities that have had the least sort of investment in terms of basic services and have the greatest levels of inequity in the country. Well, guess what? Those are the communities that consistently, persistently, regularly have violence in their region. They are instrumentalized, they are marginalized, and what we want to try and do is deliberately try in our way to have an impact on changing those conditions so that actually it is harder to instrumentalize. It is harder to bring about localized conflict and turn it into bigger subnational or even national conflicts. So again, it's about intentionality. It's about planning appropriately. I mean, for us, it's about ensuring that we can bring our scale and capacity in South Sudan to ensure that we can have an impact. Working with other partners, not just on our own, we can have an impact to a broader peace strategy that takes place. So we have examples of working together with many other organizations, multi-actor plans that look across sectors, that get communities involved in making the plans themselves. So a lot of our work is all based on community-based participatory planning, so that we can try and ensure that what we're doing is something communities are asking for, and what we're doing covers multiple sectors, because we're not going to have the kind of impact we would like to have if WFP is going it alone and looking at it only from a food lens. I mean, I think, again, it's about that deliberate approach to ensure that we focus on the areas where there are the greatest humanitarian and peace needs. I mean, we support 5.3 million people in South Sudan. Of those, 3.8 million people are supported routinely with humanitarian relief. Of that number, 1.7 million people live in the kinds of areas I'm talking about that have the least access to services, are cut off from one another, they're isolated politically, socially, economically from one another, they're isolated from markets, they're isolated from access to jobs. So what we're trying to do is recognize the problems that create the conditions that bring about conflict, and actually respond to try and change those conditions. I know I've gone beyond my 3 minutes, but if there's one word you remember, it's deliberate. Thank you.
Many thanks, Matthew. And I think it's fascinating the way that you go about to address these structural conditions and the sort of recurring problems that you pointed out facing these marginalized and excluded communities. So let me follow up on that one. You are all working in these settings where you have to share the operational space with actors with pursuing military objectives, and where I would guess that you always have an enormous amount of immediate life-saving needs ahead of you. So you mentioned, Matthew, that you are also trying to tackle these sort of longer term issues, and it would be nice if you could reflect a bit on the key challenges and trade-offs that you face, particularly with regard to the short-term versus the long-term needs, and how you strike that balance. Can I go back to you, Carlo, and have you address that question?
Thanks a lot. It's a complicated question, and of course, the way we intervene depends on a number of factors, including availability of resources, security, context, access issues, and so on. I would say that, in general, what we need to realize in a context like Colombia is that the peace process is not a linear process. So you have a very different sort of dynamics, economic, social, conflict dynamics in different parts of the country. You have a multiplicity of actors, and you have very little control over these actors. So I think the first element is to ensure that WFP is perceived as a key humanitarian actor, a principled actor that operates according to humanitarian rules. And I think this is let's say, the key safeguard for WFP and for the beneficiaries that WFP wants to support and to assist. The second factor, which I think is very important, is I think very interesting that we are doing in Colombia, is what we define protection by presence. Is basically a little bit what Matt was referring to as having a deliberate strategy. In each context, you have specific challenges, specific bottlenecks, but you also may have specific opportunities. Well, one thing we implement is in Colombia, specifically in certain areas of Colombia, the most remote, the most difficult, and the ones where, let's say, the governance and the institutionality is less present, is to ensure that our presence becomes, in fact, a beacon, becomes an opportunity, becomes an anchor for communities who have been displaced, who have been disenfranchised completely from state institutions, to see basically livelihoods opportunities, to see protection space, to see networking opportunities and new alliances and empowerment opportunities to come together. So our presence and our ability to reach these areas, let's say, is framed in the context of a complex environment in which WFP is perceived as a neutral actor. This allows us to have better access to areas that are not necessarily accessed by other actors and by national institutions. And we are received by communities as a partner, as an ally, as an entity that provides space, provides dignity, provides access to basic rights. And this has, of course, a number of potential sort of spin-off effects, and this depends on the context. But basically, our intervention are delivered in an emergency context, but with a midterm horizon, and we try to leverage the opportunities to empower communities and to transform communities if and when possible. One last element is the creation of trust and the rebuilding of trust. This has been recognized, in fact, also as part of a SIPRI study that was recently developed on Colombia. WFP, in many cases, is seen as a key actor rebuilding the notion of trust in the institutionality by communities who have been displaced, who have been affected, who have been shocked by the different, moments of conflict dynamics. And WFP somehow has a role in this, in creating a new bridge, going back to a vision of the future that is somehow disconnected from the past. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Carlo. Fascinating. Thanks for sharing these insights. Paul, what are the key trade-offs that you have been or are currently grappling with and tried to approach in a constructive way?
Well, thanks, Jannie. And I think you've identified one of them. There is that trade-off between the short term and the long term. And I think, although it is a challenge, there are ways to try to address it, including, in designing those shorter term humanitarian projects, thinking about the implications for peace and development as we are trying to do in Gwoza, and also when having that larger strategic, longer term view, thinking about the immediate interventions that are necessary and how they fit together. But I would say, I'd just like to point out two other challenges. One is that we're, as a wider community, we're really fairly good at coordinating the humanitarian side of things, the development side of things, and the peace and stabilization. But what we're not quite as strong on yet, I find, at least kind of internally as it were, is bringing all of these communities together. So sitting at the same table, having coordinated actions based on a joined up strategy. And so I think that's, putting those structures, those kind of systems in place is a challenge, but one that's imminently doable and where we can definitely make progress. And I think in all of these locations, WFP is trying to contribute to creating that kind of space. And that's a role that we can help play. But the third one would be when you have people come to the table, so you come to those meetings and you have the discussions, you realize very soon that there are different principles at work. And the humanitarians, with the focus on neutrality and independence, will have a certain set of principles. Development workers getting behind and more directly supporting the capacity of governments, peace. All those come with slightly different angles, and reconciling those and allowing also space for when they are not easily reconcilable. That's a part of the challenge, but also part of the opportunity as we work through these complex environments and really figure out how we can work at this nexus of humanitarian development and peace. Thanks.
Fascinating how you frame it in terms of different principles sometimes actually clashing. Sometimes they can be reconciled, but sometimes they cannot. But still the value of sort of getting around the same table and sort of being open about what are different constraints and opportunities for different actors sharing the same space.
Exactly.
So thanks a lot, Paul, for offering those insights. Matthew, to what extent do the challenges and trade-offs that have been outlined by Paul and Carlo resonate with your own experience?
I mean, in which case I really like to build on what Paul was just saying, because I think there is that sort of cultural, academic, conceptual sort of debate around principles and how we can cross from one description of ourselves as humanitarians into another description of ourselves in terms of trying to contribute to stability. Is complicated, peace is even more so. But from my side, the discussion around principles is one thing. It's even more complicated when we start talking about resources, because I think the world has been talking the talk of Nexus for many years now, but no one really walks the talk. So you find that Nexus programming is more siloed than, in particular, when it comes to contributing to peace and stability. So what we find is, humanitarian donors that have mandates and are given mandates by taxpayers and are asked to do what they're going to do by a set of rules, which I completely understand, can't fund outside that box. And so, for example, when we want to try, and as we have done in some instances, to expand the duration of our activities to have a 3 to 4 to 5 year window so that we can have that greater impact that can then link to contribution to a peace activity, they're in a position where they don't have that ability to support. But then when you sit with the development actors and you ask the development actors to consider it, well, but in a fragile context where there's still conflict in place, and you won't necessarily be supporting an institution, a government institution, in the activities that you're talking about, and even if they look like development with a little d, and they sort of look like peace building, perhaps with a small p, and not a big P, we can't really help you there. So you find that you're stuck in a position where you have opportunities to have a significant impact, a broader, longer term impact on a community, but you don't have the tools in terms of the envelopes to resource your plans to do it with. I mean, I think, again, though, that sounds very negative, and I don't want to sound too negative. And of course, we've been having discussions about flexible contributions, flexible donors for years, and we've been having a Nexus conversation for the last 4 or 5 years, if not longer. So, I mean, I don't feel like we're not getting there. I think we are actually getting there, and I think as donors recognize that the designs of our programs are not necessarily being imposed, but they are deliberately involving communities, and it's communities who are asking for the things that we are talking about here, that actually then it's the people at the center of the program that are defining what should be supported, not the agencies that are trying to impose and market an idea that sounds good, that might not, but doesn't have the support of the people it's going to have an impact on. So I think, you know, again, it's moving, but perhaps not as moving as fast as we would like.
So that's very interesting, Matthew, those reflections, that sort of different pots of funds come with different strings attached. And you identify this sort of gap, the bridging sort of from the shorter term towards the longer term, that this space is not clear, and there are sort of maybe institutional and bureaucratic and constraints that basically prevent the people from walking the talk. Thanks a lot. I think we'll be able to pick up on these contributions later on in our discussion. But now that we have this flavor of the ground level realities that WFP country directors face, I would like us to shift to the systems level, or strategic security perspective. And on that note, I would like to turn to Maria Vittoria, who is the head of the WFP Security Division and based at headquarters. And I assume, Maria, that in your job, you are continuously carrying out risk assessments. And as I mentioned before, the WFP is sometimes the only representative of the UN family present on the ground in the most difficult environments. So my first question to you would be, what are your red lines for going in or staying engaged in violent settings?
Thank you, Jannie, and actually good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It's very interesting, the selection also from security being in HQ, when security normally is on the front line, but thank you for that selection. Actually, I would like to zoom out a little bit and give a structured approach from the security risk management. That is indeed our bread and butter. But WFP does not do that in a vacuum, right? We are part of the UNSMS system, the security management system, that includes humanitarian, development, and peace actors. So as a function, we are quite old on the partnering with the different, with the Nexus partners, no? The focus of the risk management is to enable and support activities. And we have a very strong decision-making model based on acceptable risk that balances actually security risks with program criticality. Within that framework, WFP security function plays a specific role in basically three types of contexts. One is on the analysis. The second one is on the program design. And the third one is on the standard operating procedures. And we have a security committed to contribute to the corporate WFP's conflict sensitivity approach. So the first step is that we draw a situational analysis on conflict affected context to really understand the situation. And as you have mentioned, our presence in frontline locations is key to grasp the granularities. So what I am saying is just a framework to give you the sense of understanding who is who, mapping the actors, who are the power brokers, what are their intentions, what are their agendas, And from the security perspective, we have a privileged position to understand also the inhibiting context factor, local forces, de facto, etc. The second aspect on the program design, I don't know if you're familiar with the no program without security and no security without proper resources. So we are making sure that from the start, we are involved in the program design. We are helping identify at different levels the strategies that are addressing specific scenarios that could impact on the long term. And we are also addressing on the planning and budgeting. Security function is only part of an integral machinery working together. And what we want is to minimize the silos because they have actually huge impact. And the last point is drawing on the context-specific standard operating procedures. We need to have them well thought to actually help and support decisions in times of stress and high tempo. This is critical for us. Then you talked on red lines. Actually, we try to find innovative ways to stay and deliver. We are less focused on when to leave. That was the previous mindset. Now we are really putting a lot of emphasis on how to stay, but how to stay and deliver. No? So we need to evaluate all possible options. We leverage engagement with the stakeholders, partners, government, etc. And sometimes we need also to recognize that our presence is not needed because other partners are in a better position or have a better acceptance, or the risk profile is different. So when conditions do not allow WFP to securely reach beneficiaries, we are also having the reverse access process, right? So we are opening corridors to enable services to be provided to the community. In short, despite all the efforts done to mitigate a specific situation through the analysis, the program, the SOPs, this is the framework, and the residual risk is still too high and outweighs our ability to deliver, then probably we can say, okay, this is time to not to go, or to go in a different time, or to go in a different modality. A rapid top-down decision-making process driven from HQ is not really what security does. We are trying to empower our field staff with skills to work with a system that allows them to take the decision at the very lowest level possible, where many of the previous contributors have raised that the closest to the field, the level where knowledge and awareness of the situation is. So, yeah.
Thanks a lot, Maria Victoria, and I appreciate that you really need the very granular, high-frequency analysis from the field and the very, very close collaboration with your colleagues on the ground in order to make those assessments. So I would be curious to know what your reflections are as regards the WFP ability to impact the security dynamics or the dynamics of violence in a more transformative way over the longer term. I understand that you need to negotiate access, for instance, to get across to vulnerable populations and deliver. But are there any ways by which you can sort of impact the violence dynamics in any other way? Over to you, Maria.
Thank you, Jannie. And I think the easy answer of finding a good result would be when children enrolled in our programs have their stomach full and their families receive the assistance needed, right? That would be the straight and shortest answer. Unfortunately, it is a little bit more complicated that we have seen, and hunger is far too often used as a weapon of war. And that has an impact, of course, on security dynamics and our implementation also, right? So our aim is not necessarily to maintain or to create dependency on our programs, but actually to be able to get a sustainable access and rather have WFP to deliver as long as the program is required, right? And so it is a twofold intervention here. One is to enable the operations in the short and immediate term, and the other one is the contribution of the context stabilization. But I think a committed and deliberate approach is sometimes not enough, right? We need to be able to track, to measure progress, and to actually be honest and also recognize when corrective actions are needed. So from security perspective, the risks that can contribute inadvertently to increased conflict need to be identified at the earliest stage. We have, as I mentioned, 3 different phases where we could have that intervention, but sometimes we are not enough coordinated, we are not enough informed, risks are happening all over, and we don't have all the capacity to face that. So there's a delicate balance between a systemic approach and a context-specific one. Impartiality, the independence, neutrality are challenges that we face, and they have impacts on us, also on our partners. And we should not forget that even if there is no political intent on the programming, that doesn't mean that we don't have a political impact, right? And that pays on the longer term. So within, again, the UNSMS framework, we have incorporated the acceptance in the security management process. And acceptance is very much related to the trust that Matthew was mentioning, right? We have, acceptance is one of the ways we can measure the impact of our interventions in the longer term. So we are actually also measuring the degree of the potential threat, how the potential threat actors understand and support our activities. And this acceptance is, of course, a dynamic in time, dynamic within the progression of program. And we should understand that achieving acceptance is beneficial for operations and for security. So just to round up, and not to go far away on my minutes, we want to ensure that a sustainable access to food and implement mitigating measures that will impact on the context stabilization. And one of the ways we can measure that is through the acceptance process. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Maria Victoria. And I think it's quite impressive the way that you are also considering what other people may call negative spillovers, so inadvertent impact of your own actions, and how you then take corrective action. That is often something that organizations are less keen to address, but then it's also difficult to improve. And I also think it's commendable the ambition to go for measurements and to try to actually capture results and be able to track progress or backsliding. So, and this is also part of the WFP SIPRI collaboration around the peace measurements. So I think this is all very it's a commendable openness and attitude towards these delicate issues. I would now like to turn to Aisato Kaspar and put the focus a bit on the WFP's partnerships with other actors. Aisato, you are currently serving with the IOM, but you have been previously collaborating with the WFP in your past capacity as head of the UN Peacebuilding Secretariat in Mali. Could you please share from your experience how the WFP is partnering with others as regards, for instance, displaced populations, and how this contributes to stabilization? And I think you might want to tweak your screen a little bit so that we can see your face. Thank you, Aisato. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Jannie. Thank you for inviting me to this panel on stabilization. I'm very happy to be here and to share my experience with you. But first of all, let me congratulate you again, congratulate WFP for the Nobel Prize. To respond to your question, I want to share my practical experience on a collaboration with WFP and impact on communities and stabilization. In 2018, I was in charge of the UN Peacebuilding Fund in Mali, and the PBF financed a joint project between IOM, WFP, and UNHCR called Peers for Peace in the region of Mopti. It's in the center of Mali. We were facing a period marked by intense insecurity with counterterrorism operations, ambushes, and targeted assassinations. It was terrible. And the multiplication of intercommunity conflicts with violent conflicts over access to natural resources had led to the weakening of conflict management mechanisms in the region. So the inability of the state to provide basic social services and to protect the population had led to a deep sense of abandonment in local communities. So IOM, WFP, and UNHCR decided to get together to partner through a joint project to revitalize the economy and generate peace dividends. The project combined both humanitarian development and peace-building activities to create synergy. So we used an inclusive and participatory approach to diagnose conflict, complementarity in action between the agencies, and the pooling of resources to our partners, NGOs, were key for this exercise. Basically, IOM and UNHCR came with their experience in mobility tracking and profiling displaced communities on one hand, and WFP came with its unique expertise in food security assessments on the other hand. This combined expertise resulted in a more realistic and concrete analysis, which included the perspectives of both displaced and host communities, and in better programming. Thanks to this project, community-based conflict mediation mechanisms were strengthened. As external agencies, we could better support a more sustainable conflict prevention and resolution environment. This project and their communities also contributed to enhance peace-building capacities through improved community livelihoods and restoration of community infrastructures. Over, Jannie.
Thanks a lot, Aisato, for sharing your insights. Truly fascinating. And please let me pick up on what the UN Secretary General has said about the importance of joint analysis for collective outcomes. And it has come up in interventions by previous speakers. And you talked about this as well. So Aisato, could you reflect a bit on how joint analysis and concerted actions between WFP and its international partners and local community partners could best be achieved in practice?
I appreciate a lot this question because I think it is key in this debate. As you know, nowadays we are facing longer, more protracted kind of conflicts. This means that we cannot use a strictly humanitarian short-term approach. We need to change our way of working to increase our effectiveness and impact on the ground. The UN Secretary General reform calls for more openness and collaboration. This can be made through more shared common analysis. This shared analysis should be inclusive and not only among international actors, but also shared with communities. A concrete example I can share from my experience is also about a another project with WFP, IOM, and FAO, funded by the UN Peacebuilding Fund. And this is a project on social cohesion and reconciliation. This project made me realize the criticality of joint analysis, needs assessment, and thinking out of the box to better understand the needs of the communities and to respond to complex situations in conflict settings. The main challenge at the heart of conflict we were facing at that time was communities fighting about resources, access to resources. The joint approach combining diverse expertise allowed the UN system to better understand host communities and displaced persons and to come together as one with solutions. The project enabled communities to come out with a shared common goal and resilience plan. In that process, communities discovered that they were not against each other, and the impact was improved perceptions among and between communities. This said, I believe that funding mechanisms and donors have the possibility actually to encourage and incentivize agencies to adopt joined-up approaches. The SDGs Peacebuilding Fund works in this way, but even if we already have made some efforts in that direction, it should be a normalized approach for agencies to make a shift toward this one UN approach and get to the habit to analyze, implement, and evaluate together, and think more about collective outcomes. This should be the new normal, according to me. Over, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Aisato, for helping us situate the role of the WFP in the international community and in relation to other partners. Now the time has come to let our online audience in, and we will have a question and answer session. And my proposition is that I will ask, I think I will ask you about 2-3 questions, and I will turn to all panelists and maybe ask you to volunteer. But the first question I have received is the following. What is the evidence base used for planning and implementation of activities to promote social cohesion? And how do you capture the impact? Secondly, what instruments or analytical tools are used at the WFP to analyze the context as a foundation for programming? And then the third question is about positive peace. And it's asking whether you can share instances of how the WFP has managed to tackle underlying root causes or drivers of conflict. And if you can share anything about who in the WFP has been involved or how you went about. So on that note, I will turn to the panel again. And since I am not able to see any digital hands, I will simply turn to you, Carlo. Please take a pick or feel free to answer all 3 of them. But
thanks a lot. I would like to make a few comments, also trying to address some of the points that have been raised. First of all, I think that what we heard is that the WFP does not let's say, perceive itself as the peace-building actor, but as a contributor. No, and this is very important. I think it somehow defines our role and space in a given context. Secondly, exactly, we operate in a context vary, and our ability to analyze, understand, define the context also helps us define our, let's say, programmatic interventions and our overall strategies for the mid and for the short and mid term. Fourthly, we operate in a context which is populated by actors, hostile actors, friendly actors, allies, and so on. And so our strategy in the field is developed not in isolation, but exactly as part of a conglomerate of actors and factors that influence the opportunities to rebuild the peace. I think that in this context, one thing that we need to understand, and I perhaps repeat myself, is that very seldom a peace process is linear. More often than not, you have many factors that somehow intervene, interrupt, shock efforts underway. And WFP has, let's say, has the ability to adjust its role according to the situation, and actually is an element, I think, of stability in this situation. So WFP provides somehow a backup to the fragmentation of peace efforts. It provides continuity in lifelines to communities. It provides also, I think, continuity in the narrative about peace. And this is super important in exactly in situations where the peace effort can be fragmented. Secondly, I think we need to rescue the concept that the construction of peace is directly related to the construction of viable food systems for people. Food systems and food security is an element of stability, is an element of pacification, is an element of inclusion, is an element of recognition of the dignity of people and so on. And so I think our effort needs to be somehow, our peace building effort needs to be framed with a view to that. And in a different way, and also answering to a question that has been posed, it is an effort that strategically needs to somehow understand how we can contribute to the undoing of the war economies and of the political economy of conflict. So we need to understand what are the leveraging points in a given context in which we can intervene and we can support, doing local purchase, for example, as was being, mentioned by Paul in Nigeria, is one way of empowering community. There may be many different ways through which we can channel our assistance and leverage our assistance to empower community to build transformative opportunities and so on. And there are many, let's say, many ways to do that and many examples of that. For example, in Colombia, we are working very hard with women to empower women in their efforts to rebuild sustainable food systems at the local level in the margins of conflict areas. I would like to bring one example about this, and because it's very clear. It is about the coca economy in Colombia. The coca economy in Colombia is completely embedded in the world economy nowadays, and the real victims of this economy, of this illegal economy, are the farmers, are the smallholder farmers, are the families, the households, rural communities in general, indigenous people, ethnic groups. They've been somehow sucked into this economy because coca is the only cash crop that has a value in a conflict zone, and it's the only product that you can actually very rapidly produce and market. And therefore, people have abandoned their sustainable livelihoods and their sustainable farming, and they've shifted into the cash crop economy of coca. Now, WFP is deliberately supporting efforts, in many cases led by women cooperatives, to somehow phase out from this economy and rebuild the livelihoods in a different context. This is a deliberate context-specific intervention aimed at building peace, but it's very important that WFP somehow has the broader vision of who are the actors and what are the factors for building peace, and connects strategically to all the actors. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Carlo, and for bringing up viable food systems as an actual element of positive peace. That's an interesting observation. Aisato, I see that you also have your hand raised. Please.
Yes, thank you, Jannie. I would like to step in regarding the evidence-based used in planning and implementation, and in the promotion of social cohesion, as well as the impact of our action on the ground. From my experience, I think that as actors in the field, we have time and resources, lack of resources against us when it comes to document our action and talk about our impact. This said, I would like to talk about perception studies and community-based mechanisms, monitoring. I think that it's very important because including communities and is a way to also be to make them involved in the process. We are the actors in the field, but actually it's all about these communities. And when it comes to peace, it's very important that they are part of the project from planning to implementation. But we know that when we are working in peace building sector, we never have enough time to see the impacts because we have lack of resources and the timelines are very short. In the planification, we need more time for conflict analysis. We need more time to understand the setting we are going to operate, but and we need more time also to evaluate. And unfortunately, when we have to evaluate, it's generally at the end of the project, and it's very difficult to make the follow-up. So I think that it's very important for the agencies, for the donors, for the whole community to understand that it's key for the whole system, for our survival actually, that we give more place to evaluation, to evidence-based, to document our work in the field and to show our impact. It's very important for us to make sure that the communities also understand. So because many times we make our action, but there is no follow-up of the projects. This comes a lot, and I think that it's important that we pay attention to that side.
Thanks a lot, Santo, for this input and how to view communities as the ultimate evidence base and the measurement, how you can actually assess progress. I will give the floor to Paul and then to Matthew before we wrap up this Q&A session and proceed to the final segment. Over to you.
No, thank you so much. And again, this is a great set of questions. And on that first one about the importance of the evidence base and how do we measure impact, I just couldn't agree more. And I would echo what Isato said. This is key. And there have been attempts that we've had, with attention perception scores and other ways of getting indicators. But the main thing I wanted to say is that actually in partnership with SIPRI, WFP is taking this quite seriously and going through a very deliberate process to develop the kinds of indicators that we can measure before an intervention and after, so that we're able to see that kind of progress. So just to say that I think you're exactly right that this is a key area, and we're in progress working with SIPRI to try to address it. The second question was, I think, about the analytical tools that we have, and we do have some capacities that we've developed in our headquarters, and I'll let others speak to those, but also to say that in this kind of situation, this is where we can draw on partnerships. The analytical capacity of missions, of actors who are specialized in this area. And that helps. And that's where we really need to come together in order to benefit from our pooled knowledge of a situation. And maybe last about, that positive piece in addressing the root causes, that can happen at different scales. And I think some of the root causes relate to development and marginalization, or lack of development and marginalization, and the need for sustainable development. So when we're engaging in smart ways that actually get to that, and do it in ways that bring social cohesion rather than division, then we start to get at it. But it's also recognizing that WFP can't do everything, but we can share a vision about the things that need to be done. We can also say, hey, on the political process, this isn't something we do, but we really need actors who are focused on that, and we can add our voices to that idea, so that we are having everyone working together in one direction to resolve the root causes and achieve that positive peace. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for pointing out that complementarity, and that it's not one actor that can do everything, but to really look at comparative strengths and synergies. Final word to you, Matthew, before we proceed to the final session.
I honestly, after listening to Paul, Carlo, and Isato, I don't really now have much to add, because in particular, Paul really covered, I think, the critical component, which is, we're not doing this in isolation. We're not doing this on our own. That's why it's called contributing. And so when we are trying to measure those measurements, some of the evidence will come from things that we are, have access to and work on, and some will come from partners, and it's about bringing things together. So I'll give one example, because I won't go into greater detail, but and in South Sudan now, we're very lucky to be part of a sort of consortium of organizations that are looking, working through the Reconciliation, Stabilization, and Resilience Trust Fund in South Sudan. So we're working with the mission, the mission in South Sudan. We're working with the Veterinarians Sans Frontières Germany. We're working with a number of other actors, World Health Organization, to try and work together with communities in these kind of isolated, marginalized, areas of the country where they're suffering the most from inequity. And what we are trying to do in our side of this bigger bargain to contribute to peace is to sort of bring communities together on these sort of local perception, sort of qualitative capturing opportunities, so that we can understand on a regular basis what they're living, what are their stories, and what is their understanding of the difference that our joint activities are making. And the importance is to do it consistently, because at that point we can start to measure, indeed, if there is any change. And all of that then goes and adds to the other sort of evidence that's collected, the everyday peace indicators, and all of the other evidence that we also look at in terms of people's access to work, access to jobs, whether they're moving back and forward to markets, having access to markets, what is their food security indicator looking like as an indicator of greater stability in an area. So it's part and parcel of a bigger story. Anyway, thanks, and thanks to the people who went before me for answering the questions too.
Thanks a lot, Matthew, and I'm very inspired by all the contributions made so far. But I would now sort of challenge you to provide our online audience with your one takeaway from this session. And I will be starting out turning to you, Isato Kaspar, asking you what you think that the WFP should do more of or less of to contribute to the prospects of peace. And I will give you each one minute to answer.
Thank you, Jannie. I would like to say, for me, peace is about openness and sharing. And humanitarians like WFP must prepare the ground and should be ready to hand over to development actors and also to those operating in peace. In Iowa and Burkina Faso, we are committed to implement the Nexus, We have humanitarian, development, and peace-building activities. It is key that WFP and IOM collaborate to ensure the sustainability of this process. This is like what I wanted to say.
Thanks a lot, Aisato. So you brought up openness and sharing, being generous, and then I would turn to the WFP colleagues. What is the one thing needed for the World Food Programme to maximize its contribution to peace? What is the one thing needed to get it right? Over to you, Carlo.
Yeah, this is the $1 million question, but I mean, my impression is that what we said is that WP can have multiple roles in different contexts, and the key factor is getting the strategy right, a good strategic reading of the key actors and factors on the ground, having a short and midterm vision, having a clear understanding of the allies, and an extraordinarily clear understanding of the opportunities. I also think, and we did not mention this, but the key role of communities. In Colombia, if it was not for the resilience of Colombian communities, the country would be completely, devastated, and it's not the case. Communities are extremely strong and have an extraordinary capacity to recover and to rebuild their livelihoods. And so our attitude needs to be more the one of an actor that provides, in fact, opportunities and enabling interventions as opposed to, an external actor that comes in and fixes the problem. I would also like to end up, though, my narrative on Colombia with a positive story. And the story is actually an image. And the image is of demobilized FARC combatants who are cultivating food, vegetables in their gardens as part of their reintegration process. They build a cooperative. And WFP has been purchasing from this cooperative and has been using this food to feed the school feeding program that is being implemented in La Guajira, which is one of the most depressed and complicated regions of the country. So you see, WFP is acting on very different fronts. On one hand, is supporting the peace process, the formal peace process, enabling ex-combatants in their reintegration work, and at the same time being smart enough to leverage that opportunity and to support through local purchase. And this local purchase then ends up on the table of school kids, in their own communities. Isn't this a telling story about what WFP can contribute to peace building?
Amazing, Carlo. Thanks a lot for leaving us with that. Maria Vittoria, what is your final takeaway?
There is a poem that actually is longer than 1 minute that says, okay, I don't know the poem in English, but to have the courage to identify what needs to be changed and continue what doesn't, right? And I think, yes, we need to acknowledge that sometimes we may have a negative impact, but I think the vast majority of our actions are positive. And if I could actually reinforce and save one thing, is the quality of people that we have in the front lines, right? I mean, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing if we wouldn't have the caliber of country directors that we have here in the panel, or people who are really in the front line doing what they do best. So yeah, I think we need to be honest, but also candid with ourselves.
Thanks a lot, Maria Vittoria. So the best people in the most difficult environments. Matthew, what is your one key factor for the WFP to get it right?
I'm not so sure if it's about WFP getting it right or about us explaining it well. And I think that's about the need for us to be able to sensitize other actors, our partners, donors, that we are genuinely deliberate in trying to do what we are trying to do in terms of our contributions to peace. And we are very open for others to work with us in partnership to leverage the presence we have, the knowledge we have. I mean, we've been in South Sudan since the late 60s. The presence we have 1,200 South Sudanese staff across 10 states and working in this country. The relation that we have with the people that we serve, particularly at that community level, at that very granular level. So all of this can be leveraged in partnership to have a far greater impact than, let's say, our food security mandate alone. And that is what we want to try and do with others. It's not about going it alone. It's about supporting a bigger and broader coalition towards peace.
Thanks a lot for those words of wisdom, Matthew. And I will give you, Paul, the final word.
Thanks. And now it's my job just to echo what others have said. I mean, I love these points about the strategy, about, you know, working together, about the partnership. I think that's exactly right. I might throw in, because we've discussed it, also measurement, but it's this set of ingredients that are really the ones that will take us forward into this new space, not alone, in partnership, thinking strategically, measuring what we do, learning from that and getting better. And if we're open in that way and take these kinds of learnings forward, I think we're going to continue to be able to make contributions to peace in the future. Thanks.
Many thanks, Paul. And I would like to direct my sincere thanks to all of you. You have been fantastic and provided lots of valuable insights and lessons learned and best practices and reflections. So this has been a truly impressive discussion. I have learned a lot, and I also would like to thank our online audience for posing great questions. And if you enjoyed this conversation, you should also register for the Stockholm Forum session, Preventing Famine, Promoting Peace, on Thursday, May 6th at 1400 Central European Time. And this high-level panel also takes place in partnership with the World Food Programme. So on that note, I would like to thank everyone, and I look forward to seeing you on Thursday.